What would you do if a student begged you to save him, and everyone who could help told you to mind your own business? I was a new assistant teacher at a private elementary school when I noticed something on 8-year-old Henry, who always sat alone reading dinosaur books during recess. He was this quiet, sweet kid who never caused trouble. Henry had bruises on his arms that he'd quickly cover with his sleeves when he caught me looking. When I reported it to the principal, she said the Stewarts were loving parents, and Henry was just clumsy. I started keeping Henry company during recess and discovered this quiet kid knew everything about dinosaurs and would light up when talking about them. After weeks of reading dinosaur books together, he finally trusted me enough to really talk. One day he was struggling to hold a pencil because his hand was so bruised, and when I gently asked what happened, he started crying silently. He made me promise not to tell anyone first, then whispered, "My dad squeezes my hands when I get math problems wrong." He immediately looked terrified and begged me to forget he said anything. I told him he could trust me, and over the next few days he slowly revealed more, always checking first that no one could hear us. He said his dad hurt him when his grades weren't perfect, but that no one would believe him because his family was too important. This sweet kid who got excited about velociraptors and drew me pictures of pterodactyls was being tortured at home. I took photos of his bruises and went to the principal with the evidence. She looked at them for 2 seconds and said, "Children bruise easily," and I was overstepping my position as an assistant teacher. Then she reminded me that the Stewart family had donated millions to the school, including the entire new science wing, and Mr. Stewart was on the board of trustees. She actually said, "We don't accuse our board members of child abuse based on a new teacher's assumptions." I went to Child Protective Services myself and filed a report. The caseworker who came to investigate was buddies with Mr. Stewart from the country club, and after a 5-minute conversation where Mr. Stewart charmed him completely, the case was closed. The caseworker told me making false reports was a crime, and I should be careful about my teaching career. Henry came to school the next day walking funny, and when I asked if he was okay, he whispered that his dad had spanked him with a belt for telling me. He said he was sorry for getting me in trouble and promised he wouldn't talk about it anymore. This 8-year-old was apologizing to me for his own abuse. I went to the school counselor thinking she'd be mandated to report it, but she said the Stewarts were excellent parents under a lot of stress from running their business empire. The head teacher pulled me aside and warned me that if I kept pushing this, the Stewarts would have me fired and make sure I never taught again anywhere in the state. But Henry had started bringing me his dinosaur books to hold for him because he said his dad threw them away when he was mad. He'd slip notes into the books that said things like, "It hurts today," or "I'm scared to go home." One day Henry came in with a black eye and the teacher told everyone he'd been hit by a baseball at practice, even though Henry didn't play baseball. When I tried to correct her, she gave me a look that said, "Shut up, or you're gone." I called the police and they said without concrete evidence or Henry's parents admitting to abuse, their hands were tied. The officer actually laughed and said the Stewarts practically funded the police department's new equipment. Mrs. Stewart came to pick Henry up one day and pulled me aside with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she appreciated my concern for Henry, but that different families had different ways of disciplining children, and I shouldn't impose my values on them. She said her husband was a powerful man who didn't like people interfering in his family business, and it would be a shame if my career ended before it started. Henry heard her threatening me and later whispered, "I'm sorry my parents are mean to you too." I went to the superintendent and he said the same thing everyone else did, that the Stewarts were pillars of the community and I was a nobody making wild accusations. The nurse mentioned that Henry had been to her office with suspicious injuries dozens of times, but she was told to stop documenting them by administration. The PE teacher admitted he'd seen welts on Henry's back, but was told by the principal that he'd misunderstood what he saw. Everyone knew Henry was being abused and everyone was protecting his abusers because they had money and power. Henry asked me one day if I thought God would be mad at him for wishing he could live with someone else. Maybe someone who liked dinosaurs too. He said sometimes he dreamed about being a fossil so he wouldn't feel anything anymore. This brilliant, gentle child who should have been worried about spelling tests was contemplating death, and everyone who was supposed to protect him cared more about donations than his life. I knew I was risking my career and possibly my freedom, but I couldn't let Henry down. I had one chance to get proof that even the Stewarts couldn't make disappear. What I did next would either save Henry or destroy me completely. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I spent the whole weekend thinking about what evidence would be impossible to ignore and decided I needed to catch Henry's injuries right when they happened. Starting Monday, I stayed late every single day, grading papers in the classroom where I could see the pickup area through the window. I watched Henry leave with his parents each afternoon, memorizing his body language and looking for any signs he might need help the next morning. My phone stayed charged and ready to call 911 at any moment. After 3 days of this routine, I searched online for child advocacy groups outside our town's influence and found Kathy Medina's name on a website 3 towns over. I called her from my car during lunch, explaining I was a teacher trying to help a student, but couldn't give names for legal reasons. She couldn't officially get involved, but spent 20 minutes explaining exactly what kind of documentation holds up in court and how mandated reporter protections actually work. She told me to document everything with dates and times, take photos when possible, and keep copies somewhere safe outside the school. The next morning, I pulled Henry aside during reading time and showed him a picture of a T-Rex in his favorite dinosaur book. I told him if he ever needed help right away, if something really bad happened and he needed me to call for help, all he had to do was say T-Rex and I would understand. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded without saying anything, and I hoped I wasn't making things worse for him. That afternoon, I stopped by the nurse's office with a story about tracking Henry's academic performance and how it might relate to his health visits. The nurse looked at me for a long moment, understanding exactly what I was really asking without me having to say it. She agreed to let me know immediately if Henry came to her office, and we both pretended this was about his grades. 2 days later, my anonymous call to the Child Advocacy Center was returned by Miriam Porter, who explained their intake process in detail. She couldn't open a case without an official referral, but spent 30 minutes explaining exactly what would trigger state intervention, what kind of injuries would bypass local authorities, and which hospitals had doctors trained in abuse recognition. I took notes on everything, especially her comment that emergency room visits with certain injury patterns automatically triggered state hotlines that local people couldn't influence. Meanwhile, I'd been researching local journalists and found Raymond Krauss had written several articles about corruption in private schools 2 years ago. I sent him an anonymous email from a new account, feeding him background about the Stewart family's donations and board positions without mentioning Henry specifically. Within days, he started calling the school asking about governance policies and donor influence on administrative decisions. The principal was getting nervous about his questions, which meant people were finally paying attention to something. 3 weeks after I'd created our code word, I was helping students with math problems when Henry tried to pick up his pencil and couldn't. His fingers were so swollen they looked like sausages, purple and bent at weird angles. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered T-Rex so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I walked calmly to my desk, picked up the classroom phone and dialed 911 while the other students kept working on their problems. I told the operator we had a child with severe hand injuries requiring immediate medical attention, possible broken bones, and gave our classroom number. Within 10 minutes, I heard sirens approaching the school. The principal must have been monitoring emergency calls because she burst into my classroom just as the paramedics arrived with their equipment. She demanded to know why I hadn't gone through proper channels, why I hadn't consulted the nurse first, why I was making decisions above my position. I stood between her and Henry while the EMTs examined him, one of them immediately radioing for additional support when he saw the injuries. The paramedic gently examined Henry's hands while asking him what happened, and Henry just kept saying he fell down the stairs at home. The EMT looked at me, then at the principal, then back at Henry's hands, which grabbed and twisted, not impact injuries from falling. They loaded Henry onto a gurney while the principal followed them, trying to call the stewards and manage the situation. I grabbed my documentation folder from my locked desk drawer and followed the ambulance to the hospital in my own car. At the emergency room, Dr. Evander Stover took one look at the x-rays showing multiple fractures in different stages of healing and immediately called for additional imaging. He pulled me aside after examining Henry and said he was filing a report with the state hotline for non-accidental trauma, bypassing our local CPS completely. He'd seen enough child abuse cases to recognize the patterns, and Henry's injuries showed repeated trauma over months or possibly years. The hospital social worker arrived within an hour to take my statement, and I handed over copies of everything I'd documented, including dates of previous injuries, photos I'd taken, and the notes Henry had slipped into his dinosaur books. She spread them out on the conference room table, comparing my documentation to the medical records they were creating. She said my notes matched the injury patterns perfectly and would be crucial for the investigation. The state hotline Dr. Stover called triggered an immediate response that our local connections couldn't block. Within an hour, Mr. Stewart burst through the emergency room doors with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. They walked straight to the nurse's station, and Mr. Stewart's voice carried across the waiting area as he demanded to see his son immediately. The nurse pointed them toward the treatment rooms, and I watched them march down the hall like they owned the place. Dr. Stover met them at Henry's door and blocked their entry with his clipboard held across the doorway. Mr. Stewart's face turned red as he pushed past other families trying to get closer to the doctor. The lawyer pulled out official-looking papers and waved them at Dr. Stover, who didn't even look at them. Dr. Stover explained that medical protocol required a full evaluation when a child presented with injuries consistent with non-accidental trauma. Mr. Stewart grabbed the doctor's arm, but Dr. Stover pulled away and called security on his radio. 2 guards appeared within seconds and positioned themselves between Mr. Stewart and the treatment room door. The lawyer started threatening the hospital with lawsuits while Mr. Stewart paced the hallway making phone calls. Dr. Stover walked back to where I was sitting and asked if I had any documentation about Henry's previous injuries. I handed him my folder with dates, photos, and the notes Henry had hidden in his dinosaur books. He sat down next to me and went through each page carefully, comparing my notes to what he'd seen on the x-rays. He took the folder to the nurse's station and started adding everything to Henry's official medical chart on the computer. The nurse helped him scan each photo and note into the system while Mr. Stewart watched from across the hall. Dr. Stover typed detailed notes about how my documentation matched the healing patterns visible in the imaging, He created timestamps for each entry and had the nurse witness his additions to the record. Mr. Stewart tried to approach the computer, but security stepped forward and he backed away. The next morning, I was still at the hospital when a man in a gray suit introduced himself as Barry Wilkins from State CPS. He had a professional badge and a thick notebook that he opened to a fresh page. He asked me to start from the beginning and tell him everything about Henry and the school's response. I talked for over an hour while he wrote constantly, stopping me to ask specific questions about dates and names. He wanted to know exactly who said what and when they said it. He asked about the principal's exact words when she dismissed my concerns. He wrote down the caseworker's name who was friends with Mr. Stewart at the country club. He asked detailed questions about the head teacher's threat to my career. He wanted specifics about the nurse being told to stop documenting injuries. His questions were completely different from the local caseworker who had dismissed everything in 5 minutes. Barry showed me forms he was filling out and explained each section as he completed it. He took photos of the bruises still visible on Henry's arms with an official camera. He asked for contact information for every school employee I'd mentioned. 2 days later, Barry called to tell me Aurora Lockwood from the district attorney's office wanted to meet with me. Aurora arrived at the hospital conference room with 2 assistants carrying boxes of files. She explained that Barry's preliminary findings suggested a pattern of systematic cover-up that went beyond just child abuse. She had me go through my story again while her assistants took notes and organized documents. She showed me subpoena forms and explained I would be required to testify about everything I'd witnessed. She asked questions about the Stewarts' donations to the school and Mr. Stewart's position on the board. Her assistant started creating a timeline on a whiteboard, showing each incident and the school's response. Aurora explained they were building a case for emergency removal of Henry from his parents' custody. She said the medical evidence combined with my documentation gave them enough for a hearing. That same afternoon, I got a call from the principal telling me not to come to the school on Monday. She said I was suspended immediately for insubordination and violating protocol. She said calling 911 without administrative approval was grounds for termination. I asked about my personal belongings in my classroom, and she said security would pack them and leave them at the front desk. I drove to the school and found 2 security guards waiting with a cardboard box of my things. Other teachers watched from their classroom doorways as the guards walked me to my car. The head teacher stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, shaking her head at me. Nobody said anything, but I saw the nurse mouth, "I'm sorry," before turning away. The next day, my phone started ringing with calls from an unknown number that turned out to be Raymond Krause. He said he was a journalist who had been investigating unusual donation patterns at private schools. He'd heard about a situation at our school, though he didn't have specifics yet. I told him I couldn't comment on an ongoing investigation, but he said he was publishing an article anyway. His piece came out that evening online, discussing how certain private schools seem to have donation irregularities. He didn't name our school specifically, but anyone local would recognize the details. My phone lit up with texts and calls from other teachers who suddenly wanted to talk off the record. 3 teachers called to say they'd also seen things but were afraid to speak up. Meanwhile, Miriam Porter from the Child Advocacy Center contacted me about scheduling Henry for a forensic interview. She explained it was a special process designed to help children talk about difficult experiences safely. The interview would happen in a child-friendly room with trained specialists who knew how to work with traumatized kids. She said I couldn't be present, but she would keep me informed about any developments. The interview was scheduled for next week, and she assured me Henry would be treated gently. Parents from the school started reaching out with different reactions to everything happening. One mother sent me a message saying her daughter missed me and asked when I'd be back. Several parents said their kids were asking why I wasn't at the school anymore. More supportive messages followed, though plenty of others called me a troublemaker who was destroying a good family. The community was splitting into camps, with some believing Henry needed help, and others defending the Stewarts. My phone rang late one evening showing Mrs. Stewart's number, and I almost didn't answer. Her voice shook as she insisted they were good parents who just had high expectations for Henry. She said her husband was upset about the misunderstanding and wanted to resolve everything quietly. She mentioned that teaching jobs were hard to find and offered to help me financially if I reconsidered my statement. I put my phone on speaker and started recording while she talked about amounts and bank transfers. She promised $50,000 if I told authorities I'd made a mistake about Henry's injuries. I saved the recording and immediately sent it to Aurora, who said it was evidence of witness tampering. Aurora called the next morning to tell me the emergency removal hearing was scheduled for next week. She said I would definitely be subpoenaed as the primary witness to Henry's abuse. She wanted to meet to prepare me for what would happen during cross-examination. We spent 3 hours in her office going over potential questions the Stewart's lawyer might ask. She warned me they would attack everything from my experience as a new teacher to my personal life. They would try to make me look unstable or like I had something against wealthy families. Aurora had me practice staying calm while she asked hostile questions about my motivations. She said the key was sticking to facts and not getting emotional no matter what they said. The next morning, I saw the head teacher on the local news standing outside the school with reporters asking questions about Henry's case. She looked straight at the camera and said she had absolutely no knowledge of any abuse happening to any student at her school. She claimed the first she heard about these allegations was when the hospital called about Henry being admitted. Several teachers stood behind her nodding along, even though I knew they'd seen Henry's bruises too. My phone started buzzing with texts from coworkers telling me I needed to see what was happening online. Someone had created a Facebook page called Stop the Lying Teacher, with my photo from the school website plastered across it. The page already had hundreds of comments calling me every name you could think of. People were saying I was trying to get famous by destroying a good family. Some comments said I probably hurt Henry myself and was blaming the Stewarts. My personal Facebook started getting flooded with messages from strangers telling me horrible things. One message said they knew where I lived and I should watch my back. Another said teachers like me were what was wrong with schools today. I screenshot everything and called Aurora, who told me to come to her office right away. We spent 2 hours filing a police report about the threats while she documented everything for our case. The officer taking the report seemed more interested when Aurora mentioned she was from the DA's office. Meanwhile, Barry called to tell me he'd opened an investigation into the original CPS caseworker who closed Henry's case after 5 minutes. He'd discovered the caseworker and Mr. Stewart weren't just buddies from the country club, but actually golfed together every Sunday. The caseworker had also received several complaints about not properly investigating cases involving wealthy families. Barry said this pattern of behavior was finally getting the attention it deserved from state officials. 2 days later, Miriam called with an update about Henry's forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center. She said Henry had started to open up to the therapist, but was still really scared to say too much. He kept asking if his dad would find out what he said, and if he'd get in trouble. The therapist noted clear signs that someone had coached Henry on what not to say, and threatened him about talking. Even with his fear, Henry had disclosed enough that the therapist was deeply concerned about his safety. She said Henry mentioned being hit with objects and having his hands squeezed until they hurt. The therapist's report would be crucial evidence even though Henry couldn't tell everything yet. That same week, the hospital sent over Henry's full medical imaging results to Aurora's office. The x-rays and scans showed old rib fractures that had healed at different times over the past 2 years. There were also healing patterns on his arms consistent with being grabbed and squeezed repeatedly. Dr. Stover wrote a detailed report explaining how these injuries couldn't have happened from normal childhood accidents. He documented that the pattern and timing showed systematic abuse over years, not isolated incidents. Aurora called me after reviewing everything and said this medical evidence was impossible for the Stewarts to explain away. She decided to file for dependency court, rather than wait for criminal charges, which could take months. She explained dependency court focused on Henry's immediate safety with a lower burden of proof than criminal court. We could get him protected now while building the criminal case for later. The hearing could happen within weeks instead of waiting months or years for a criminal trial. She said keeping Henry safe was more important than punishing his parents right now. By this point, I was really struggling without my teaching income and bills were piling up. Every school I applied to in the area sent rejection letters, most not even giving me an interview. One principal actually called me and said off the record that the Stewarts had contacted every private school in the state about me. He said he thought what I did was brave, but he couldn't risk his school's donations by hiring me. My savings were running out fast, and I started looking at jobs outside of teaching just to pay rent. That's when Kathy called and said she'd found a pro bono lawyer who wanted to help with a whistleblower complaint against my school. The lawyer specialized in retaliation cases and said what happened to me was textbook illegal retaliation. We spent days documenting every threat, every action the school took against me, every job rejection that seemed connected. The lawyer said we had a strong case that could take years, but might result in real accountability. 3 weeks later, the dependency hearing date arrived, and I walked into the courthouse feeling sick to my stomach. Aurora had warned me the Stewarts' lawyer would try to destroy my credibility, but I wasn't prepared for how mean it would be. For 3 hours, I sat in that witness chair, while their lawyer asked me about everything from my limited experience as a first-year assistant teacher to why I thought I knew better than everyone else. He suggested I had something against wealthy families, and asked if I was jealous of the Stewarts' success. He brought up that I was single with no kids and implied I didn't understand parenting. I kept my voice steady and stuck to exactly what I'd seen and documented about Henry's injuries. When he tried to twist my words, I calmly repeated the facts about the bruises, the broken fingers, Henry's own words about being hurt. Aurora had taught me well, and I didn't let him make me emotional even when he basically called me a liar seeking attention. After my testimony, Dr. Stover took the stand with his medical files and x-rays. He explained in clear medical terms exactly what Henry's injuries showed and how they happened over time. The Stewarts' lawyer tried to suggest the injuries could be from sports or playing rough with friends. Dr. Stover calmly pointed out that Henry didn't play sports, and that the specific spiral fractures in his fingers only happened from intentional twisting. He showed the court comparison x-rays of actual accidental injuries versus Henry's injuries. His testimony was so precise and scientific that even the Stewarts' expensive lawyer couldn't shake his conclusions. The medical evidence spoke louder than any of us could, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Mrs. Stewart took the stand next, and I watched her smooth her dress and adjust her pearls before sitting down. Aurora started asking her basic questions about Henry's daily routine, and Mrs. Stewart answered confidently at first, saying Henry was an active boy who played sports and roughhoused with neighborhood kids. Aurora pulled out a school form Mrs. Stewart had signed 2 months ago, stating Henry couldn't participate in PE due to a medical condition. Mrs. Stewart's face went red, and she said that was temporary because of an injury from falling off his bike. Aurora showed another form from 6 months earlier with the same excuse. Mrs. Stewart shifted in her seat and said Henry fell off his bike a lot because he was learning to ride without training wheels. Aurora asked which hospital treated these bike accidents, and Mrs. Stewart said they used home remedies because the injuries weren't serious. Aurora then showed the x-rays Dr. Stover had presented, pointing to fractures that happened at different times over 18 months. Mrs. Stewart said Henry was accident-prone and they couldn't watch him every second. Aurora asked why none of these accidents were ever reported to a doctor until I called 911. Mrs. Stewart's voice got higher as she said they didn't run to the doctor for every little bump and bruise like some parents. Aurora asked her to explain the spiral fractures in Henry's fingers that Dr. Stover said only came from twisting. Mrs. Stewart said maybe it happened when Henry got his hand stuck in something, but she couldn't remember what. Aurora asked if she was present when Henry got hurt, and Mrs. Stewart said sometimes but not always because her husband handled discipline. The judge leaned forward and asked Mrs. Stewart directly what kind of discipline her husband used. Mrs. Stewart looked at her lawyer, who nodded, and she said they used timeouts and taking away privileges, never physical punishment. Aurora showed a photo I'd taken of Henry's black eye and asked Mrs. Stewart to explain it. Mrs. Stewart said that really was from baseball practice, even though Aurora pointed out Henry wasn't on any baseball team. Mrs. Stewart then changed her story and said it was from playing catch in the backyard. Aurora asked who Henry was playing catch with, and Mrs. Stewart said she didn't remember. Maybe a neighbor kid. The judge asked Mrs. Stewart if she'd ever seen her husband hit Henry, and she said absolutely not, but her hands were shaking as she said it. After 3 hours of testimony from various witnesses, the judge called a recess to make his decision. I sat in the hallway feeling sick while the Stewarts huddled with their lawyer looking confident. Aurora told me she thought it went well, but judges were unpredictable, especially with wealthy families. 30 minutes later, we were called back in, and the judge looked serious as he started speaking. He said the medical evidence combined with testimony showed clear signs of physical abuse that couldn't be explained by normal childhood accidents. He ordered Henry's immediate removal from the Stewart home and placement with a certified foster family. The Stewarts would get supervised visitation twice a week at the CPS office, not unsupervised time. The judge said this was temporary pending a full investigation and evaluation that would take at least 6 months. Mr. Stewart jumped up and started yelling that this was ridiculous, and his lawyer tried to calm him down. Mrs. Stewart was crying and saying they loved their son, and this was all a misunderstanding. The judge said his decision was final, and they could work with CPS to potentially regain custody if they completed parenting classes and therapy. I felt my whole body relax for the first time in months, knowing Henry would sleep somewhere safe that night. 2 days later, the school board called an emergency meeting about what the newspapers were calling a scandal. Parents were demanding answers about how the administration missed or were ignored abuse signs for so long. The board voted to place the principal on administrative leave while they investigated, though she insisted she'd done nothing wrong. Some board members who were friends with the Stewarts defended them and said this was all blown out of proportion. Other board members distanced themselves quickly, saying student safety was their top priority, and they'd had no idea this was happening. The meeting got heated when parents started yelling about cover-ups and demanding resignations. The board announced they'd hire an outside firm to investigate and make recommendations. Raymond's full investigation article came out that same week with the headline about corruption and cover-ups at elite private school. He'd interviewed the nurse and PE teacher who finally felt safe talking about being told to ignore Henry's injuries. He had records showing the Stewarts donated money right after each time someone reported concerns about Henry. The article showed how the principal got a raise after dismissing my first report, and how the superintendent's new house was partially funded by a Stewart business investment. Comments online were split between people calling for everyone involved to be fired and others saying Raymond was doing a hit piece on a good family. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting my side of the story, but Aurora told me not to talk to anyone yet. The principal called me the next day, and her voice was cold as she told me she was filing a complaint with the state board about my teaching practices. She said I'd violated protocol, broken confidentiality rules, and created a hostile work environment for other staff. My lawyer said this was retaliation, and we'd fight it, but the process would take years and cost thousands in legal fees. Even if I won, the complaint would be on my record, and schools would see it when I applied for jobs. I was also told through Aurora that Mr. Stewart was refusing to cooperate with any court orders, wouldn't let CPS do home visits, and his lawyer kept filing motions to delay everything. They were demanding Henry be returned immediately and threatening to sue everyone involved. But the judge's order stood, and Henry stayed in foster care while the legal fights continued. A week after the hearing, Miriam called to say she had something for me from Henry. I met her at a coffee shop, and she handed me a folded piece of paper with a drawing on it. Henry had drawn a big T-Rex standing over a smaller dinosaur, protecting it from danger, and at the bottom he'd written, "Thank you," in his careful handwriting. I started crying right there in the coffee shop, because it was the first time I'd heard anything from him since he'd been removed. Miriam said Henry was doing okay in his foster home and was starting to open up to his foster parents. She told me Henry had asked about me and wanted to know if I still liked dinosaurs. The foster family was kind and patient, letting Henry take things at his own pace. Miriam also said Henry had started trauma therapy, and the therapist was using his love of dinosaurs to help him process what happened. They'd act out scenarios with toy dinosaurs where the little dinosaur learned it wasn't his fault when the big dinosaur was mean. Progress was slow because Henry still blamed himself for causing problems, but he was engaging with the therapy and seemed calmer. Aurora filed new motions requesting extended removal and full psychological evaluations of both parents. She argued that Mr. Stewart's refusal to cooperate showed he wasn't taking responsibility, and Mrs. Stewart's testimony showed she either participated in or enabled the abuse. The court granted the motion, meaning Henry would stay in protective custody for at least 6 more months while evaluations happened. The Stewarts would have to complete psychological assessments, parenting classes, and therapy before even being considered for unsupervised visits. Kathy reached out to me with information about a support group for teachers who'd been retaliated against for reporting abuse. She connected me with 3 other teachers from different states who'd gone through similar experiences. We started meeting online once a week to share resources and strategies for dealing with the legal battles and career damage. One teacher had won her case after 4 years and got a settlement. Another was still fighting, and the third had changed careers entirely. They helped me understand what I was facing and how to protect myself while fighting back. We shared lawyer recommendations and tips for documenting everything. It helped to know I wasn't alone in this fight. The school board meeting 3 weeks later was packed with parents and reporters after Raymond's articles stirred up the community. I sat in the back row watching 3 teachers I'd never expected to see stand up during public comment. The PE teacher went first and told the board about seeing welts on Henry's back and being ordered to ignore them. The school nurse followed him and read from her personal notes about Henry's injuries that she'd kept secretly at home after being told to stop documenting them. Then another teacher I barely knew stood up and said she'd seen Henry crying in the bathroom with bruises on his arms, but was told by the principal to mind her own business. The board members looked uncomfortable as more people started murmuring, and the board president called for order. He announced they had no choice but to launch an external investigation into the school's handling of mandatory reporting. 2 days later, the principal was placed on extended leave pending the investigation, and an interim principal from the district office showed up asking everyone questions about what they'd seen and reported. She interviewed me for 2 hours and took copies of all my documentation, while making notes about policy violations. My lawyer called that afternoon and said the school was preparing to fire me for cause based on insubordination and violating protocols. He advised me to resign immediately before they could formally terminate me, because it would protect my teaching license and ability to work elsewhere. I typed up my resignation letter that night with shaking hands, because giving up felt like betrayal, even though I knew it was the smart move. The next morning, I turned in my keys and badge and walked out of the school for the last time while other teachers watched from their classrooms. Finding new work proved impossible as every private school in the area had somehow heard about me being a troublemaker who caused problems for donors. I applied to 30 schools and got rejection emails from all of them without even getting interviews. The public schools weren't hiring mid-year, and substitute teaching required district approval that kept getting delayed for background check issues. I started tutoring kids in math and reading just to pay rent, but it barely covered my bills, and I had to borrow money from my parents for groceries. One afternoon, Miriam called and asked if I could meet her for coffee because she had something to discuss. She offered me a part-time position at the Child Advocacy Center doing intake interviews and helping families navigate the reporting system. The pay was half what I'd made teaching, but I accepted immediately, because at least I'd be doing something meaningful again. My first week at the center was overwhelming as I learned their protocols and shadowed experienced advocates during family meetings. Then I got assigned my first solo case helping a mother who suspected her ex-husband was hurting their daughter during visits. I walked her through the reporting process and connected her with resources and helped her document everything properly. The case moved forward successfully, and the child got protection, and the mother thanked me with tears in her eyes. Using what I'd learned from my mistakes with Henry to help other families felt like turning something terrible into something useful. Meanwhile, Miriam updated me that Henry's removal had been extended again after a supervised visit with his dad went badly. Henry had been doing better in foster care, but seeing his father triggered nightmares and bedwetting and refusing to eat. His therapist recommended reducing contact to phone calls only while adjusting his treatment plan to address the setback. The foster parents reported Henry was asking about me and wanted to know if I still remembered the dinosaur facts he'd taught me. A week later, the local news reported that Mr. Stewart had resigned from the school board to focus on family matters. The remaining board members voted unanimously to review all donation policies and establish new governance structures with better oversight. They also approved new mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and reporting abuse without fear of retaliation. The community stayed deeply divided about everything that had happened, with some people calling me a hero at the grocery store. Others would glare at me or mutter about how I'd destroyed a good family over nothing. I learned to shop at different stores and avoid certain restaurants where Stewart supporters gathered. Parents from the school would see me and either thank me for saving Henry or accuse me of causing unnecessary drama. The online harassment continued, with people posting nasty comments on social media calling me an attention seeker. My support group helped me deal with the threats and showed me how to document everything for potential legal action. Aurora called one afternoon to update me on the criminal case and said charges were still being considered, but the evidence threshold was tricky. She was building the case slowly and carefully because she only had one shot at prosecution and couldn't risk losing. She said Henry's safety was the priority right now, and keeping him in foster care mattered more than rushing to trial. The investigation into the school was revealing more problems as other families came forward with concerns that had been ignored. 3 more children were identified as potentially at risk, and CPS opened new cases based on the external investigators' findings. The superintendent announced early retirement rather than face questions about what he knew and when he knew it. Miriam called me 2 weeks later with news that made me drop my coffee mug. Henry had started opening up to his therapist by bringing his plastic T-Rex toy to sessions. He'd make the dinosaur act out what happened to him, showing how the bigger dinosaur would hurt the smaller one when it didn't do things right. The therapist recorded everything as Henry used the toy to demonstrate specific times his dad had grabbed him or hit him. Henry showed her exactly how his dad would squeeze his wrists until they turned purple when he got homework wrong. She documented every detail Henry revealed through the dinosaur play, building evidence that would help both the dependency case and possible criminal charges. While Henry was making progress in therapy, I threw myself into creating training materials at the Child Advocacy Center. I spent hours writing guides for teachers about spotting abuse signs and understanding their legal rights when reporting. The materials explained how teachers could protect themselves from retaliation and what federal laws actually protected whistleblowers. Miriam loved what I created and wanted to expand the program to 3 neighboring counties. We started scheduling workshops where I'd teach other educators what I wished I'd known when I first saw Henry's bruises. 6 months had passed since that day I called 911 and my life looked completely different. The advocacy center job paid less than teaching but covered my bills and gave me purpose. I wasn't just helping one child anymore, but creating systems to help dozens. My bank account was stable again after months of struggling with tutoring jobs. The work felt more meaningful than anything I'd done in a classroom. Meanwhile, the external investigation into the school released its findings, and they were worse than anyone expected. The report documented systematic failures at every level of administration. It showed how complaints about various students had been buried for years to protect wealthy donors. The investigators recommended complete policy changes and new oversight structures. 3 assistant principals quietly resigned rather than face public hearings about their roles. The head teacher who'd threatened me took early retirement with no explanation. New policies required all staff to report suspected abuse directly to authorities without going through administrators first. Around this same time, Miriam shared updates from Henry's foster family that made me smile for the first time in months. He was making friends at his new school and catching up on all the learning he'd missed. The foster parents said he taught other kids about different dinosaur species during lunch. He'd started a dinosaur club where kids would meet to share facts and draw pictures. His grades were improving and he wasn't scared to make mistakes anymore. The foster mom said he still slept with his T-Rex, but the nightmares were getting less frequent. Barry called me with news about the original CPS caseworker who'd dismissed my report after talking to Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes. The state investigation found multiple cases where he'd closed reports involving wealthy families without proper investigation. He'd been transferred to a desk job filing paperwork while they reviewed his entire case history. Barry had implemented new policies requiring supervisors to review any case closure involving board members or major donors. All investigators now had to document conflicts of interest and couldn't work cases involving their social connections. 2 months later, I got an official letter asking me to testify before the State Education Committee. They were considering new legislation to protect teachers who report abuse. I spent 3 hours answering questions about what happened when I tried to help Henry. The committee members took notes as I explained how I was threatened with losing my teaching license for doing what the law required. My testimony helped them understand why teachers stayed silent even when children begged for help. The legislation they passed 6 weeks later made it illegal to fire teachers for good faith reporting. It also created a fund to help whistleblower teachers with legal costs. Just as the new school year started, Aurora called with shocking news about Mrs. Stewart. She'd filed for divorce and was seeking her own custody arrangement with Henry. Her lawyer had reached out to prosecutors about possibly cooperating with the criminal case. Mrs. Stewart was ready to testify about what she'd seen and heard in their home. She wanted immunity in exchange for providing evidence against her husband. Aurora said this could be the breakthrough they needed to file serious charges. The divorce filing included claims of domestic violence and financial control that painted a different picture of the Stewart marriage. A full year had passed since I made that terrifying 911 call that changed everything. Miriam invited me to coffee to share how Henry was doing with his foster family. They'd decided to adopt him, and Henry was excited about having a real family. He was getting therapy twice a week and making real progress dealing with his trauma. The foster parents said he laughed now and played like a normal kid. He'd even joined a youth soccer team, though he still preferred reading his dinosaur books. The adoption hearing was scheduled for next month, and Henry had asked if I could come. With Mrs. Stewart cooperating, the criminal case against Mr. Stewart finally started moving forward. Aurora said they were preparing multiple felony charges, including aggravated child abuse and assault. Mrs. Stewart had provided photos and recordings she'd secretly kept over the years. The evidence she gave filled in gaps that prosecutors couldn't prove before. Mr. Stewart was facing the possibility of serious prison time if convicted on all charges. The Child Advocacy Center called me 3 weeks later about a promotion to program coordinator overseeing training for mandated reporters across 3 counties. I accepted immediately and spent the next month developing curriculum based on everything I'd learned from Henry's case. My new office had maps with pins marking every school district where I'd be training teachers about recognizing abuse signs. I created workshops that walked educators through their legal rights and protections when reporting suspected abuse. Teachers from dozens of schools attended my sessions, and many stayed after to share their own stories of being silenced. The training materials I developed became the standard across our region, and other advocacy centers started requesting copies. Meanwhile, Miriam called with news that Henry's adoption hearing was finally scheduled after months of paperwork and home studies. The courthouse had a special family courtroom decorated with murals of animals and nature scenes. Henry's new parents had arranged a whole dinosaur theme for the celebration with fossil decorations and a cake shaped like a stegosaurus. Miriam sent me photos from the hearing showing Henry wearing a tie with tiny T-Rexes on it and grinning between his new parents. The judge let Henry bang the gavel to make the adoption official, and everyone in the courtroom clapped. His new family had even legally changed his last name so he could have a completely fresh start. Aurora called that same week to tell me Mr. Stewart had decided to take a plea deal rather than face trial. The prosecutors had offered him 5 years in state prison if he admitted to the abuse charges. It wasn't nearly enough time for what he'd done to Henry, but Aurora explained that this meant Henry would never have to testify. Mr. Stewart would also have to register as a child abuser and could never work with children again. The judge accepted the plea, and Mr. Stewart was taken into custody immediately to begin serving his sentence. The school board held an emergency meeting after the plea deal became public and voted to implement every reform recommendation from the external investigation. They hired a new principal who actually had a background in child psychology and mandated reporter training. Every staff member had to complete 40 hours of abuse recognition training before the new school year started. The nurse was given authority to document any suspicious injuries without administrative approval. 3 different sets of parents contacted me through the advocacy center after hearing about Henry's case in the news. Their children had also been showing signs of abuse, but the parents hadn't known how to navigate the system. Each case I helped coordinate resulted in children getting the protection they needed. One mother cried in my office, thanking me for giving her the courage to believe her daughter. Another family's case led to criminal charges against a coach who'd been hurting multiple kids for years. Raymond's investigative series about institutional corruption protecting abusers won a state journalism award 6 months later. He called to tell me he was donating the entire $5,000 prize to the Child Advocacy Center. At the award ceremony, he said our collaboration had changed how he approached every story about vulnerable populations. His articles had sparked investigations at 3 other private schools where similar cover-ups were happening. The series also led to new state legislation requiring schools to report abuse allegations directly to state authorities. Henry's new parents reached out through Miriam about 8 months after the adoption to say they were moving to another state. The dad had gotten a job transfer, and they thought a completely fresh start would help Henry heal. Before they left, Henry wanted to send me something through the advocacy center. Miriam handed me an envelope with a drawing of a whole dinosaur family standing together under a rainbow. There was a mama dinosaur and papa dinosaur and a little dinosaur between them, all smiling. Henry had drawn hearts floating around them, and at the bottom he'd written in careful letters, "Thank you for believing me." I kept that drawing framed on my office wall as a reminder of why this work mattered. 2 years passed, and I was offered the director position for a brand new state program focused on protecting vulnerable children. The program would coordinate between schools, hospitals, and law enforcement to identify at-risk kids before abuse escalated. My interview panel included state legislators who'd read my testimony and wanted someone with real experience. The position meant overseeing a team of 20 advocates and managing a multi-million-dollar budget. I'd be developing statewide protocols and training hundreds of mandated reporters every year. Every child we helped through the program made those early threats and career losses worth it. My path from assistant teacher to state director hadn't been planned, but Henry had changed everything. That scared little boy who loved dinosaurs had given me a purpose bigger than any classroom. And that's the takeaway from this one. Hopefully you can use a bit of it in your own life. If you want more stories that come with lessons, hit that subscribe.